Guys, welcome back to Coliseum Forum. I'm very excited about our guest today. We've had publishers and artists and writers. This is actually our first musician, and we'll explain why he's joining us on Coliseum Forum today very shortly. But I'd like to introduce George. George, you just told me how to say your last name, and I messed it up already.
It's awesome, Billy. Haj, and I tell
George
people
Hage.
Haj like Mirage
There you go. Okay.
is the
So
easiest way to remember it.
I'm joined today by George Hage, lead singer of Jack the Radio and writer of well, it actually came out, what, last week, right?
2 weeks ago,
Two
yeah,
weeks ago,
very
yeah.
recently.
The Creatures Anthology, which is awesome. So let's just kind of jump right into that. You have your new album comes out tomorrow, right, for Jack the Radio. Um, when was the decision made that you guys were like, hey, we're kind of going to do this comic project along with the album? I mean, I know making an album is a huge process to begin with, but you guys were like, hey, we're going to do this other thing on top of that as well.
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to say I knew from day one we were going to do a comic, but it definitely came together towards the end of the recording process. Uh, it took us about 3.5 years to make this record.
Yeah,
We had some lineup changes, some other projects that were going on, uh, but finalized the band with Kevin Rader on drums, Dan Griner on bass, and Danny Johnson, who he and I have been playing for almost 10 years together in the band. Um, but it was really towards the end of last year, around September, that was looking at some of the lyrics for the songs and have been a long time comics fan, comics reader, have gotten to know some artists over the years and writers over the years through conventions, uh, and had two songs in particular, "Creatures," which is became the title track, and a
right,
track called "Don't Count Me Out." That lyrically, I was like, man, these would just be really cool sequential stories.
right.
Let me reach out to a couple people that I know to see if they would even be interested in drawing this.
Sure.
So reached out, and surprisingly, the answer was like, "Yeah, that sounds pretty cool. Like, let's talk more about it." And I think from there, kind of adapted the songs into scripts. I actually took a script that to name drop Scotty Young had sent me for Middle West a couple years ago. It's the only vision of a script that I had ever seen, and had worked with Scotty on doing some music for Middle West. So he was kind enough to share that with me. But Scotty, sorry, I totally used your scripts as my basis. It was my education on script writing. And then luckily, everybody I worked with was super cool. They didn't beat me up too bad for the roughness of the scripts, and gave their input. It just was an amazing experience, man. And it came together really in like the last 8-9 months of getting the record finished.
Yeah.
Uh, and yeah,
I mean, you did. I mean, you mentioned that you reached out to a lot of guys and you didn't know what the reception would be, but I mean, you kind of really assembled an A team for that book. I mean, Aaron Conley, big fan of Aaron Conley, Sabretooth Swordsman and Bully Wars.
oh yeah.
Matt Allison, you've got with Cancor, Alexis Zurich, Space Riders. I mean, and I mean that's three out of like 8 creators you worked with, like 8 artists.
Oh man, it was by the end of it, it was 30 illustrators and colorists.
30 illustrators in color. Yeah, that's insane. So it's like that. It's like a Justice League of like indie guys right now.
Totally, totally. And that's, I mean, and again, I'd like to say I knew from day one, like all these people would sign on and do this awesome work. But it was really, I didn't know what it was going to be. I was like, worst case, I'll get a few pages for a couple songs,
Right.
add some other content, and we'll do a little comic or whatever it's going to be. But, as the first couple lined up, it was like, well, why wouldn't we do these for a couple other songs on the record? So created some scripts for those and reached out to people, and more people said yes. And then I was like, well, why don't I try to do this for every song on the record?
Right.
And I didn't know if people were all going to do it or if people were going to say yes, and was super excited at the people that said yes and that we were able to get. It's 1 to 4 page stories for
Right.
each song. Um, and I will add, there were definitely several no's to the project, which is awesome. I mean, what's success without rejection?
Sure, sure. Now we mentioned that you have really like an all-star lineup, drawing this book. Was there anybody that said no that was like devastating?
uh, no, I mean, everyone that said no, I mean, hopefully it's in the way that I approach people, but everyone that I talked with that said no was super respectful. It wasn't a fit, or they didn't have time, or whatever it was.
Right.
So luckily, it wasn't nothing too devastating. I mean, there were definitely some I'll call it negative response where I reached out and their no was no response at all.
Sure. Okay.
Which again, I understand. People
Right.
are busy, and who the hell am I
Right.
saying come work on this comic that may or may not work, may or may not happen. But was stoked. I mean, I agree 100%. All the names you mentioned and everyone that worked on this book, like I am ecstatic that they said yes, and at the work that they turned out. It's been wild.
So with that said, you mentioned that you kind of used a script from Scotty Young as the basis because had you tried to write comics prior to this anthology?
Man, I had tried. So I also do illustration and design work,
Sure.
but very much outside of comics. But have always been a comics fan. Being a musician, have done a lot of work in the music world,
Right.
with album art, and T-shirts, and definitely see a lot of overlap with the music world and with the comics world.
Sure.
And see a lot of overlap in some of the designs. I mean, some of my favorite album covers, probably most of my favorite album covers, are either illustrated or like Frazetta paintings.
Yeah. Right.
That he did, those old Molly Hatchet covers.
Yeah.
So I haven't successfully done any comic work. I've messed around trying to do some of my own stories, but I think that's going to be ongoing for many years from now.
Sure. So let me ask you this. I assume you obviously help with writing the songs in your band, right?
Yep.
How different is it to write a song versus writing a comic?
Man, I'll tell you, I got a lot out of this process, more than I thought I would get out of it.
Sure.
Going into it, with writing a script, you're now thinking on a completely different level. With the song, you're thinking about syllable counts to a degree. You're thinking about, will these words work with the melody I have? Can I tell the story I'm trying to tell in the amount of time that the song is? If it's 2 verses, 3 verses, all that stuff. But with the comic, it was, what's the story here? And these comics, they're 1 to 4 pages, so there's not like a huge arc of a story
Sure.
that's happening. But it's assigning visuals, and that's where I leaned on the artist a lot, and was grateful to be able to work with the people I worked with, because I'm like, Matt, here's the idea, here's kind of the outline of the story, like run with the visuals. Like, what are the creatures, the monsters that you would draw? Like,
Right.
how would you draw Jack from Jack the Radio? Like,
Right.
And really everybody I worked with, man. And that was also one of my favorite things, was just seeing how people interpreted the character. Like, Aaron's drawing of Jack is
Right.
very different from Matt and Alexis.
Sure.
And it's beautiful to me. And it was awesome to see, there was kind of guidelines of the look and feel of the
Right.
character. And there's kind of this like future sci-fi version that's on the cover,
Right.
that Matt did. And then there's, the more like modern day nudie suit wearing, cowboy hat wearing version of the character. But yeah, I mean, I got a lot out of it, because I feel like it gave me deeper meaning into what the songs were. And
Sure.
now that I'm like playing them back, it's like I see the visuals of the comic, which I've never had that before.
Yeah.
It's
Absolutely.
super cool.
So, you mentioned this kind of this project started to come together as you guys were kind of wrapping up on the album itself. At what point were you comfortable where you were like, okay, yeah, I think this might actually work? Like when pages started coming in, or when guys were saying yes?
I mean, honestly, I think I was comfortable way too early in the process. I reached out to the publisher, Wave Blue World, I think early February, to start talking about the idea of having a publisher for the book. And luckily, Tyler and Wendy were folks that I met at Heroes Con in 2019. And we had a connection with Chris Bruner, who did a story in the book, and Rico and Chris Visions, who had all worked with them in the past on some different books. And I think at that point, I think, maybe Brandon Graham, Matt, and like Nick Cagnetti had started working. And I had several other people that, said they would work on the book, but I didn't have a ton of pages or even a ton of like thumbnails for pages
Right.
at that point. But they were awesome, man. Like Tyler, we didn't know what the page count was going to be. We didn't know all the names that were going to be in the book. So it made it kind of difficult to market it. I had actually had the cover art. I had commissioned Matt to do back in 2016.
Oh, wow.
And the band kind of went on hiatus for other projects and just life things. So we had never used it. We were going to use it for a poster.
Yeah. No, I mean,
And,
it's awesome.
it's just been sitting in the archives for 4 years. So I was like, well, we've got this art. We can use this for the cover. Like we've at least got a cover, and the logo had already been created for
Right.
the album. So I was like, well, we've got the logo for the header. Let's see where this goes. And luckily that whole team, man, at Away Blue World, Tyler, Wendy, Justin, Hazel, like have all been awesome, super supportive, and really helpful along the way.
So in terms of being in a band, right? Or
Yep.
being a comics creator, what is the cooler job? Because they're both pretty much the fantasy job, right? So what do you think
yeah.
of the two? What is the cooler?
Man, well, I feel like things have been equalized a little bit with COVID, because definitely one of the coolest parts about being a musician is being able to play shows,
Sure.
being able to travel, being able to hear live music, hang out with musicians, like just feed off that energy. Since we're not able to do any of that, like I feel like it's been very equalized, where it's a similar feeling now with putting the comic out and
Right.
and getting feedback online, getting texts and stuff from friends, which has been freaking awesome. That I think it's going to be a similar feeling when we put the album out tomorrow.
Right.
That we're not really able to go out, and same thing with comics. We're not able to do conventions and hang out and see our friends and meet people at conventions. We're not able to do that either with music right now.
Right.
So I guess the lame answer is they're neck and neck.
No. In my head, that's how I imagine. They're still like,
Yeah.
these are the two coolest jobs you can have, either rock star
Seriously,
or
man.
comic book creator. Yeah.
Yeah.
So let me ask you this: Have you always been a comics guy? Like, have you always been into the medium?
I mean, I have since I was a kid, but I definitely I had a hiatus from comics.
Sure.
Late 90s, early 2000s, which depending on who you talk to is probably the best time to take a hiatus from
Yeah,
comics.
for sure.
Although there was a lot of good stuff those years too, but basically like end of high school into college, that's kind of when my music started taking music more seriously.
Sure.
Uh, also just with school, man, like just didn't have time, didn't have money to go buy books.
Right.
Any money I had, I was going to the local record shops and buying stuff from their used bin
Right.
every Tuesday, back when albums used to come out in the middle of the week instead of Fridays.
Right. So let me ask you this: since you do two of the coolest professions out there, what is your inspiration? So when you're sitting down, I mean, it's been 4 years since the last Jack the Radio album, right? Or 5?
5 almost.
5 years, yeah.
Yeah.
When you're sitting down to create an album, I mean, how are you inspired? Like, where does that music come from?
Yeah, I mean that's a tricky one because it's not one thing. I will say a lot of this record is the most personal record that we've done. It's a lot based on personal things that's happened over the past 5 years.
Sure.
But also lyrically, I wanted to keep things general enough that if my specific situation hadn't happened to you, you can still relate to the song.
Right.
Um, but you know, in addition to just like life, I feel like I'm cheating sometimes in a way with inspiration by going to comic conventions
Sure.
and having the opportunity to table at conventions, because it's like music doesn't really have this where there's a direct way to hang out all weekend with people that make the art or create the art that you're picking up off the shelves all throughout the year.
Right.
You can actually go somewhere and hang out with them
Right.
and talk to them and ask them questions face to face, and then in the evenings potentially hang out with them. And music, I hate it that music doesn't really have that. I feel like the closest thing is going to a festival, but you
Right.
still don't have that one-on-one interaction that you have at comic conventions. So I feel like I'm cheating, but I get so much inspiration. It's such a recharge, you know, because you're seeing people that are your friends. You're seeing people
Yeah.
you've never met, and you're seeing their art for the first time, and getting to talk to them and like ask them about their process, or ask them like, you know, how did you even think of this? Like, what inspired you? And then you can even get some feedback on your own art, which
Right.
is like, uh, you know, you don't have to have that, but it's such a nice thing to get from time to time.
Yeah.
Because art and music sometimes can just be very isolated. You know, you're working, especially now, and I loved all the memes when COVID hit with shelter in place, and people were just like, this is the artist life already. Like, we're
Right.
always at home, we're always sheltering in place.
So
Yeah,
you,
no, I'm,
so you the art. If I understand correctly, the argument is like with comics, there's a greater community that you can be a part of and kind of interact and kind of, you know, run your art by your friends and get feedback and vice versa. But with music, it's more kind of like isolated and kind of into yourself, right?
yeah, and I mean, you get some of that in music. I feel like if you are a musician, you know, when you play shows with people, especially when you do tours with people, uh, you can get that one-on-one interaction a lot more. But I feel like as a general lover of music, you know, going to shows is your only outlet to get that interaction and to be able to ask those questions. And there's not always opportunity at shows to meet the band or to talk to them or ask them
Sure.
questions. So that's one of my favorite things about the comics community is that access through conventions. And for the most part, that community being very open and excited to talk about comics and art and storytelling.
So let me ask you this. I mean, there in the past, there's been a lot of overlap between music and comics. I mean, Code and Cambria did some comics.
Yeah.
Even like Ghostface Killa at one point did some comics.
Oh yeah.
Oh wow,
Kiss, Public Enemy.
Kiss, Public Enemy, My Chemical Romance.
Oh yeah.
What do you think it is? What do you think the draw is for that overlap? Right? Like, I mean, do you think it's a creative medium or?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's both. For me, my initial crossover was, you know, I started with comics, but then started guitar, and then getting into just like rock albums and things like that, and
Yeah.
seeing like Grateful Dead art and seeing like Zeppelin art, and the stuff that like the San Francisco crew with like Mouse and Griffin and I mean, so many that I can't even think of the names. But just looking at like what they were doing, there's such a like illustration and art is very rooted, I feel like, in rock and music. And that definitely influenced me, even stepping more into like Americana, country, blues. I mean, even blues. Crumb did like, I don't know, a ton of blues art,
Yeah.
and album art. And Gilbert Shelton's another like favorite, you know, trying to find some of his, like, he used to do posters. I think it was Stomp was the production company, like in the late 70s. And you know, that you find that stuff and you're like, who is this guy? And then you're like, oh, he did a bunch of like indie books. Now I
Right.
got to go find those books.
Right.
So I think it's like just such a natural crossover, and it's rooted very deep in music. Comics are very rooted deep in music. And like one of my favorite things is there's so many comic artists that secretly or not so secretly play music as well.
Right.
Rico Renzi, killer colorist, artist, awesome dude. Hopefully he's not get mad at me for saying this, but that guy used to play bass in a ska band back in the day.
Oh,
Um, I know Matt Allison plays some guitar.
yeah.
Like a lot of the people I worked with, either are music fans or musicians themselves in a way.
Right. No, that first of all, I think you just dropped some trivia out there for the bigger comic book geeks. Like Rico Renzi played in a ska band, and Matt Allison plays guitar. That's awesome. But prior to this album, I mean, you've done some comics inspired music, right? I mean,
Yeah, yeah.
I've heard the Sabretooth Swordsman song. I've also heard rumors that there's a Middle West song out there, right?
It is.
And there was one other song as well.
Yeah, we ended up doing so. This was a side project called Doom Punks, and it's music inspired by your favorite indie comic books, is I think the tagline we created. So yeah, there's 5 songs. It's all on streaming services. But we did a Kankor song as well.
That's awesome.
We did a Deadly Class song, a I Hate Fairyland song, and a Middle West song.
Awesome.
Such a blast. Yeah.
So is it when you approach those kind of projects, is that different than like when you're approaching like a Jack the Radio album?
Totally. That is way more fun. Let's create like the punk rock Saturday morning cartoon
Right.
jingle as if Sabretooth was a cartoon, which it needs to be, by the way. Aaron, I don't know what you're doing today, but you need to
Work on that pitch.
on that.
Yeah. So, I did obviously read up on Jack the Radio. I was already a fan of you guys, but you started in college, right? You went to UNC, right?
NC State.
NC State. Okay. So you went to NC State, and wait, what was that? Is that like a gang sign or?
That's the Wolfpack.
Oh, the Wolfpack. Okay. And then, what made you really kind of pursue music?
Yeah, I mean, I started playing guitar. I think I was 13, and started writing music shortly after. And once I got to college, started meeting some other people that were into music, more serious about music, and kind of showed me like, hey, we can team up and start a band, or like we can go play shows. And there's always been like a pretty solid music community in the Triangle and Raleigh, Chapel Hill area, that also got a lot of inspiration from, in a much broader, more over time kind of way, meeting people and talking to people over the years. But yeah, I was really in college that toured in a band towards the end of college and after college, and then kind of move into different projects.
And I'm sorry, the way our studio is set up, I'm looking at viewer engagement and things like that, to make sure that like people aren't asking questions and we're just ignoring them. So we actually do have a question. What's your favorite comic book convention you've ever been to?
Oh man, I've only been to probably about 5 shows, but I go pretty much every year. And my local shows are definitely my favorites. Heroes Con is one of my favorite weekends of the year.
Sure.
We play the Drink and Draw, and it's been awesome working with Chris Sparks and Team Cul-de-sac and the Heroes Con crew on that. And then there's a great local show in the Triangle area, the NC Comic Con. It's always a blast as well.
So this is a question I've asked a lot of artists, writers, publishers. They do the con tour every year because that's how you drum up excitement. What's your craziest convention experience?
Oh man, so I think the most intense show was NC Comic Con. I've only been 1 year in 2013, and was lucky enough to know Tommy Lee Edwards at the time. So he was able to help me get in the convention, and that is the most insane experience I've ever had, because it's at the Javits Center, and for those who haven't been there, it's a giant glass cube that it's enormous, but the artist alley is this like tangent building that's a fraction of the size of the center, and it's this tiny like tube basically that you walk from one building to the other, and it feels like 5,000 people trying to walk down a hallway in both directions at once, which, as you can imagine, doesn't work very well.
Right.
But got to meet Chris Claremont at that show. Got in early, so was able to. I was the second person at his table, and of course, the guy in front of me had like 2 short boxes of comics for Chris to sign, which I was super bummed about. But then I quickly realized, as Chris was signing each book, I'll call him Mr. Claremont. I shouldn't call him Chris. Mr. Claremont was signing each book, and he's telling the story. He's like remembering writing the book.
Right.
I'm like, this is the coolest thing that's ever happened to me, is like hearing Chris Claremont talk about why they changed Miss Marvel's uniform in this issue.
Right.
And I'm like, I'm no longer mad that this guy has like 50 books he's getting signed. This is like such a cool history lesson for me. And then I had some Wolverine stuff that was like a huge fan. And at that time, the Logan movie in Japan, the Japan story had just come out. So I got to talk to him a little bit about that. And it was a cool weekend, man. Got to run into so many people, see some friends up there. Carla, one of my friends from Heroes Con, ran into her, and she's like, this morning I went to get coffee and snacks and David Bowie was there. I'm like, okay, this is why New York is the coolest. And then I was leaving that night and was standing at the corner waiting for the light to change. And this guy walked up next to me, and I look over, and it's Robert Kirkman, who was not a guest at the convention.
Right.
I guess he was Walking Dead. The show was out at that point.
Sure.
And the cast was there, so I'm sure he was there for that.
Right.
But it's New York, so I didn't say anything to him. I was just like, hey, man. And then we both crossed the street and went our separate ways. And
I have that
fun experience, man.
I have that same story being in New York, but it was Kevin Smith, and I was not as well behaved as you. I like yelled at him and scared him, and it was a whole thing. So
that's awesome.
Yeah, but no, New York, especially when you get around conventions and things like that. I mean, it's amazing who you'll run into, right? Like David Bowie, or you got to hang out and listen to Chris Claremont reminisce about writing X-Men. Like,
yes,
where else can you experience that?
Exactly, man.
So we're literally on the eve, like it's the penultimate day before your new album comes out. What is that like? I mean, does it feel a little bit like, Christmas Eve, or like, what is this like?
It's like, I imagine a parent with like quintuplets on Christmas Eve. Like, it's exciting, but stressful at the same time.
Sure.
I'm very grateful. The comic and album are not coming out on the same day, because that would be, I think, a lot to have on my shoulders right now. We originally were expecting to have them come out the same week and had planned to launch at Heroes Con, but it's worked out how it's worked out, and still super excited. We had a ton of pre-orders that went out, and it's been awesome the past couple of days seeing people start to post pictures, getting messages of people listening to the record. So thanks to all those people that pre-ordered. You're the best, and hopefully they're enjoying hearing it before anyone else. But yeah, myself, the band, we are super excited.
So, we kind of touched on this a little bit. We're living in the time of COVID. I assume usually, with a record release, you guys, tour to support the album, right? Yep. What do we do now?
That we have had so many conversations about this. So we're all social distancing. We're trying to be as safe as possible. We do FaceTime meetings weekly. And we had, if you can imagine, back in the end of March, we had started rolling out our plan to release the record and try and line up partners to premiere videos, and trying to line up whatever press and radio stuff we could get. So this stuff takes, and with comics too, I'm learned a lot this year on that side as well. You don't just put something out. There's a lot of prep that goes into these things. So we had a lot of conversations back in March and even into April of like, what do we do? Do we delay this thing? Do we
Right.
wait? Do we wait it out? Is there an end in sight? And ultimately, we all agreed COVID's not going away anytime soon.
Right.
It's a serious thing. So we just wanted to get the record out. We know there's not going to be touring, but we're lucky and loving that you guys and your crew does events like this, that we're
Sure.
able to hit. We're able to talk with you in Florida
Right.
from my home office, man. This is awesome.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
So we're trying to do this kind of stuff. That seems to be the best way. And actually, tomorrow night, I'm going to be streaming a solo unplugged performance from a local venue.
Okay.
There's going to be no audience, no crew. It's just going to be basically me and someone to let me in and run the building. Probably Adam. Adam, thanks for coming out tomorrow. Sorry to make you do that. But
Will this be on your social media tomorrow?
It is, yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
Are you going to be playing stuff from the new album or?
Yeah, so I'll be doing a set, unplugged acoustic from the new record, which I'm super excited.
Yeah.
And also a little nervous because I haven't played any shows in months.
Well, I mean, so, I mean, Jack the Radio got started when you were in college, and I mean, you're more than 10 years into this.
Oh, yeah. Yep.
Does that nervousness that never goes away? It's not like riding a bike?
It never goes away. I think luckily now to whatever degree, there's a level of autopilot.
Sure.
That when you're stressing or panicking, and you're not thinking, it's you can kind of stop and you're like, oh God, I'm still playing. It's time to sing.
Right.
Where early on I didn't have that, and that anxiety would just be crippling to an extent where it's like I'm not even playing at all.
Right. So we talked about this a little bit earlier. You literally do two of the coolest jobs that anybody could do ever. You're a comic book writer and you're in a really cool band. In 30 years when we're old men and you look back, what for you are going to be some of the highlights of your career, either musically or creatively?
Man, yeah, I mean, this has been a huge, just completing the comic book, the team of artists that said yes to the comic book, to a Wave Blue World saying yes to publish it. It's definitely a huge accomplishment for myself, for everybody involved, hopefully, that this thing even exists, and that I think it worked.
Sure.
It's a very, it's a non-traditional book. It's not your average comic. It's not going to be like a arc of stories, although I hope there's opportunity to do more and
Sure.
extend some of the stories that we started, and keep creating, man. I think that's my biggest hope is 30 years from now, I've done more, that we've done more, that we keep creating, that we keep pushing ourselves. Like that's all I can try to do.
So with the anthology itself, it is a companion to the album, right? Like each story is a song on the album.
Yep.
The album comes out tomorrow. The book is already out and available at comic shops.
Yep.
Coliseum, if you want to pick it up, come in, let us know. We will order it for you happily. It is a super good book. I've read it. But would you recommend somebody read them together or listen and read together?
Honestly, that's my hope. And, I think, and again, I'll credit Scotty a little bit. When we worked on the Middle West project, definitely took inspiration from that it was creating, you're hitting a whole new sense,
right,
with the sound, in conjunction with the story, and hopefully they complement each other, that you do consume them together. That is definitely a hope. I don't think there's a requirement to have both at the same time. I think the album stands alone from the comic and the comic stands alone from the album, but I think there is a hopefully enhanced experience
if you bring them together
and listening together. Yeah, exactly.
Very cool. No, honestly, that's the thing I've been most excited about doing. Like I said, I've had the opportunity to look through the book. I've heard the first single from the album. I'm really excited for tomorrow because then I get to listen to the whole album. What you talked about with Scotty Young and kind of enhancing the experience. With the book itself, are there any of the stories that, like, they're mostly like 4-page stories? Is there anything you want to kind of expound on, like anything you want to kind of make bigger?
Yeah, I mean, I would love to do. I would love to expand on the Jack the Radio universe.
Sure.
That part of doing this book was hoping to do a little bit of world building of like, let's create this character, let's do some different moments in time in Jack's story, and I think it'd be awesome to dive deeper in like more of the origin and like even some, I don't know, man, like I haven't had enough time to put the thought into it, but like a weird collaboration where like Jack's on stage with Billy Gibbons from ZZ Top, and then they have to like
That would be awesome.
fight robot dinosaurs. I
Right.
don't know, man.
The sky's the limit, right? When you mix the
Yeah,
two.
yeah.
Yeah.
And that's the cool thing for me is like I feel like there's no restriction on what could be done.
Right. Now, let me ask you this. Now that you're a comic book writer, do you, the first thing you went after was like your own creation, right? Like you've got Jack from Jack the Radio. As a comic book fan, is there any book, like any existing character that you think you'd like to write?
Oh man, that's my initial response is no, partially because I feel like I need more practice.
Right.
But I would love to. My biggest thing is it's not so much the character. I think it's more about the collaboration for me.
Sure.
I think if there's another artist out there, or team out there that I respect and love their work, like I would totally be open to doing work together. Like
Sure.
That was one of my favorite things of this whole process, was being able to work with all these artists and see their process, and was very eye-opening. Like everybody's so different in their how they work,
Right.
Their time management, how they communicate, and then just seeing like also, I've studied this stuff before, but just seeing real time from script to thumbnails to pencils to inks to color,
Right.
to print, like you can't read that you can read it in a book, but it's a totally different experience going through that process. And I got to do that with 13 different artist teams for stories, and then another 16 on pinups and things like that.
Right.
It was invaluable, man.
So let me ask you this. We'll say a year or two from now, and the anthology part 2 is coming out. What were the lessons you learned with your first comic that you would really kind of take into the second, whole process from beginning to end?
Man, yeah, that's a great question. I think just I hope, I hope the scripts got better each time.
Sure.
I by the time everything was moving so fast, like I didn't really have a ton of time to do revisions, and
Right.
Everybody was kind enough that they didn't balk at the scripts that I sent, and instead they had their own recommendations or things that they just ran with, which honestly is the reason I wanted to work with the team that we worked with.
Right.
Yeah, I hope the scripts just keep getting stronger, that I keep learning. I think everybody's kind of in that boat.
Sure. Yeah.
With each project.
Absolutely. Well, George, you've got an album tomorrow. You've got a comic out today. It's been out for 2 weeks, but swing by your local comic book shop to check out the Creatures anthology. George, you are awesome. Thank you so much for your time today. Congratulations, man. That is a really, really cool comic, and I'm super looking forward to the album tomorrow.
Dude, Billy, thank you so much. Thank you to the whole crew that's doing these videos. I love watching these. It's super cool. We said it before the interview. It is awesome that Coliseum does these. I'm shocked more places aren't doing it, and it's probably because the amount of work that goes into these. So thanks for having me, man.
Yeah, of course. All right, guys, that's it for Coliseum Forum today. We will see you next week.